Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I actually filed this thinking that you might like it. In the bill, there's a provision about criminal street gangs. Members, in the bill, there's a provision about criminal street gangs, and all that my amendment does is add organizations that engage in acts of domestic terrorism. And I don't know why we wouldn't do this. If we're going to focus on criminal street gangs and say that they can't and honestly shouldn't avail themselves to the new protections and privileges that the bill awards, then why would we allow domestic terrorists to do it? In defining domestic terrorism, I stay within the four corners of the Patriot Act, but in almost every single way, criminal street gangs and domestic terrorists are described the same way. My point is, if it's going to be applied to the Crips, it should be applied to the Klan. I don't know if the author is going to accept it. I don't know why he wouldn't. I don't know why we wouldn't do this.
Mr. Anchia, for what purpose?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Yes.
The gentleman yields for questions.
So if I understand your amendment, you are saying that people should not be able to bypass the licensure regime in current Texas law if they are not only members of criminal gangs, as is spelled out, criminal street gangs, as is spelled out in House Bill 1927, but also if they are on a list that is kept by the Department of Homeland Security of domestic terrorist organizations, correct?
That's right.
And examples of those domestic terrorist organizations might be what?
Something like the Ku Klux Klan or another radical group like that. And by the way, the definition of criminal street gang are three or more persons having a common identifying sign or symbol or an identifiable leadership who continuously or regularly associate in the commission of criminal activities. That's in the statute. Domestic terrorism defines activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal law of the United States or any state and appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. My point is, if we're going to focus on criminal street gangs, which by the way tend to be black or brown, why would we also apply it to domestic terrorists who just so happen to engage in the same kind of activity, but also tend to be of a different background? There's no reason to vote this amendment down, except to keep the bill clean. But if one part's already there, why would we put the other?
And so your view on this is probably informed by testimony from the FBI director to the Senate Judiciary Committee just last month on March 2nd, when the FBI director said, I would certainly say, as I think I've said consistently in the past, that racially motivated violent extremism, specifically the sort that advocates for the superiority of the white race, is a persistent and evolving threat. It is the biggest chunk, he goes on to say, of our racially motivated violent extremism case for sure, and racially motivated violent extremism is the biggest chunk of our domestic terrorism portfolio. That's the FBI director, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to the Senate Judiciary Committee. You're probably aware of that threat that we're seeing in the United States of domestic terrorism.
I would be surprised if any of us were unaware of that. Look, we already have criminal street gangs in the statute. Now we have the opportunity to add domestic terrorists. And the question is, why wouldn't we? What is the argument against adding these groups? I don't know what it is, so we should do it.
Thank you. I think you've got a good amendment.
Thank you. Move passage.
The chair recognizes Mr. Schaefer to speak against the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Constitutional rights in this country are taken away after due process, and there may be some very good arguments about things like criminal street gangs and domestic terrorism organizations that after due process they should be persons who are prohibited from carrying firearms. And those due process arguments should be brought up another bill on another day. I know, like Representative Mary Gonzalez has brought up a bill.
So, gentlemen,
There's some real problems with
Mr. Bernal, for what
the
purpose?
criminal. If you give me
Gentlemen,
just
you-
one moment.
Okay.
Just a moment.
Putting someone on any kind of list, even the things that we think are good lists, like terrorist organizations, should always involve a judicial process. And those are very important considerations. And certainly no one here wants someone who's dangerous to possess a weapon, but that's not the purpose of this bill here today. For that reason, I will be opposing it, and I'll be happy to yield to my colleague for some questions.
Thank you, sir. Representative Schaefer, you mentioned lists and whether or not someone appears on those lists, right?
Yes.
And in the Patriot Act, they talk about organizations that someone may be a member of. Is that right?
I haven't read the Patriot Act lately.
Okay.
I'll take your word for it.
But we do include criminal street gangs, don't we?
There is no judicial process involved in state law to have someone placed on the criminal street gang list. And so what my bill has done is we haven't tried to address it one way or the other. We simply are restating current law.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but the bill lists criminal street gangs, but you just said there is no list for criminal street gangs. Is that right?
There is.
And there's a database that can be checked to see if a street gang exists, and
But there's no judicial process that is required in order to put someone on that list. None.
And so what you're saying is you're comfortable with the inclusion of criminal street gangs, but you are uncomfortable with the inclusion of domestic terrorists as it's defined in the Patriot Act.
No, sir, not at all. In fact, I'm supporting a bill in the Homeland Security and Public Safety Committee that would reform that part of the code dealing with criminal street gangs so that a judicial process is required in order to make that finding to put someone on the list. So what I'm telling you is that that issue about the criminal street gangs is not the purpose of this bill. The purpose of this bill is
But it's in the bill.
it's in the bill only because we had to conform the way some statutes are drafted.
You're saying it's not the purpose, but it's in the bill. Are you offering an amendment to remove it from the bill?
That's not why I'm here today. I'm
But
here on a
question,
different
though,
purpose. I'm supporting legislation to reform that
Representative
through
Schaefer-
a different bill. Because
Representative
you know that sometimes we take policy in chunks, and I just don't think that's a policy discussion for
Representative
today.
Schaefer, there's no greater poster child for having bills in the process that don't pass than me. So the fact that there's another bill isn't germane to this piece. Are you offering an amendment to remove that part from your bill?
I don't have any further amendments.
So what you're saying then is that we're keeping the criminal street gang part, but we're not going to accept the federal Patriot Act definition of domestic terrorist.
That is not the purpose of this bill. Those lists are not the purpose of this bill. My bill remains neutral as to the criminal street gang list, and it just doesn't fit with the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish in this bill.
How can the bill be neutral to a criminal street gang when they're specifically named?
Because I make no substantive change to that area of the law whatsoever. In order to reorganize the statute, we just had to move it from one part to the other. That's all we're doing.
Sir, if I say Blood or Crip or Vatos Locos, do you know who are likely to be the members of those organizations?
What's your point?
My point is that we are focusing on organizations, criminal organizations, that the membership is primarily African American and Latino, and we have an opportunity to add traitors, right? Seditionists, domestic terrorists, who also so happen to be primarily, as Representative Anchia mentioned, white, and we're going to keep one in, and you're going to oppose adding the other.
Have you filed a bill on this subject?
That is not my question.
Well, that's my answer to you is have you filed a bill on this subject?
Is it true or not true that you are opposing this amendment?
I'm opposing this amendment because the policy discussion on this is best placed somewhere else.
You think that the policy discussion about which members of a criminal organization should or shouldn't be subject to this bill is better left to a different time and place than this?
There are bills moving through committee that are related to these.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
The chair recognizes Mr. Bernal to close on the amendment.
Members, let's be clear. This bill does include a definition of criminal street gang, a group or groups that I am not protecting or endorsing. But what I am saying is, why would we? Why would we apply this bill to Bloods and Crips, Kings and Vatos Locos, right? But not the Klan or groups like the Klan? What is the rationale? If the rationale is there are other places in this body to discuss that, then what do we have these two microphones for? It's in the bill. I'm adding to what's in the bill. I'm not introducing something new. If it applies to the Crips, it applies to the Klan. That is your vote. I close the amendment. Thank you.
The question occurs on adoption of the amendment. Record vote was requested by Mr. Kaysen. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Schaefer voting no, Mr. Bernal voting aye, Mr. Ranchia voting aye. Show Mr. Harless voting no. All members voting. There being 66 ayes, 79 nays, the amendment fails to adopt.